I'm Sue Lee with the Asia program. Today's event is China's Tibet policy in the aftermath of last spring's unrest. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge a member of the audience, former program associate Mark Moore. We owe it to him for conceptualizing and organizing this event. Thanks, Mark. So Tibet remains one of the most vexing issues for the Chinese leadership. The series of protests that began on March 10th in Lhasa, capital of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, was one of the most severe displays of anti-Beijing and anti-Han Chinese sentiment since the 1959 Tibetan insurrection. Both Tibetans and Han Chinese sustained casualties. The protests then extended throughout Tibet into the neighboring provinces of Sichuan, Gansu, Yunnan, and Qinghai. After the March protests and their suppression, the Chinese government agreed to reinitiate talks with representatives of the Dalai Lama. It remains unclear, however, whether these talks will ever result in meaningful progress, as the Dalai Lama announced this past weekend that he has lost hope of reaching agreement with China regarding the future of his homeland. We are very pleased today to have our three panelists with us. Our first speaker is Dr. Elliot Sperling of Indiana University. Professor Sperling's research focuses on Sino-Tibetan relations and Tibetan history. His publications include The Tibet-China Conflict, History and Polemics, Tibet in Medieval Trade, Travel and Explorations, and Encyclopedia, edited by John Block Friedman and Kristen Malser-Fig, Exile and Descent, The Historical and Cultural Context in Tibet since 1950, and All in Submission, A Tibetan Aristocrat at the Court of Qianlong, which appeared in International Review of History. Our second speaker is Dr. Alan Carlson. Dr. Carlson is currently with Cornell University. He recently co-edited a publication on rethinking security in East Asia. He is also the author of Unifying China, Integrating with the World, the Chinese Approach to Sovereignty During the Reform Era. Most recently, he was also a recipient of a Fulbright Hays Fellowship from the U.S. Department of Education to conduct research at Peking University. He currently serves as the director of the Undergraduate Studies Program for the Government Department at Cornell University and is a core faculty member of Cornell's New China Asia Pacific Studies major. Our final speaker is Dr. Lobsang Sangay, a research fellow at East Asian Legal Studies program at Harvard Law School. He was a recipient of the 2004 Yongke Kim 1995 Prize of Excellence for his doctoral dissertation and received a Fulbright Fellowship to study at Harvard Law School. In his Track 2 initiative, Dr. Sangay has organized 5 unprecedented conferences between Chinese and Tibetan scholars, including an unprecedented meeting between the Dalai Lama and 35 Chinese scholars at Harvard University in 2003. He has been consulted by the news media and has published articles about the Tibetan issue in the Harvard Asia Quarterly and the Journal of Democracy. So now let's begin our presentation with Dr. Sperling.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you for that warm introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I've basically been asked to provide some historical background and to situate the current events within an historical context, and I'll do that, but don't worry, I'm not going to start with the collision between the South Asia plate and the rest of mainland Asia and then take you up through the rest of Tibetan history in real time. But nevertheless, history is important. It's very important in Sino-Tibetan relations for a number of reasons. Those of us who do Tibetan history are well aware of the fact that, for instance, the Dalai Lama has often said that, well, past is past, and we can disagree on the past, but why don't we think about the future? Whereas the Chinese government, of course, has always maintained that one of its preconditions for dealing with the Dalai Lama is the Dalai Lama has to accept that Tibet has historically been a part of China. This is part of a larger policy question, about which I have my own opinions, and I think some of my panelists may either agree or disagree, but I will speak about that. What is often missed on the Tibetan side when Tibetans are talking about this, that is from the point of view of opposition, is just how important history is in this whole formulation of Sino-Tibetan relations. Basically, China says that Tibet is a part of China because history says so. It's not because there are good policies being followed in Tibet, although the Chinese government will say, indeed, there are good policies being followed in Tibet. It's not because there are great economic benefits to be found in Tibet, although the Chinese government will say there are great economic benefits to be found in Tibet. These don't form the basis, because if you formulate the relationship between Tibet and China on the basis of whether or not the policies are good or whether or not there are economic benefits, you open the door to, well, if there are no economic benefits, then maybe this is not a good relationship. If the policies are not good, well, then maybe this isn't a good relationship. In many ways, and what I'm going to say is going to sound arcane. I've said it before, and I hope now I've honed my explanation so that it makes sense. There is a certain Marxist teleology involved in this. Now, we all know that so many aspects of life in China are post-Marxist, they're post-Maoist, and this is certainly obvious to anybody who goes there. Certainly in intellectual circles, people are no longer going around in circles with Marxist dogma in areas in which clearly it's irrelevant. But nationality policy is one of these areas in which there's nothing really to replace the old teleology. That is to say, the old idea that the various nationalities in China have grown together because of an historical process that is understandable through Marxist dialectics. If there was something else that could replace it and which would sufficiently justify the immutable tying of Tibet to China, well, then perhaps that would come up. But there is nothing which seems to do. It's one of these things like the one-party dictatorship. Theoretically, why do you have a one-party state in China? Well, this is because the party happens to be the vanguard party of history. Now, this is Marxist metaphysics. But nevertheless, there's nothing that can replace it, which would guarantee the dominance of one party. If you say, well, the party gives us a good life, the party, of course, would say, well, it's true, we give a good life, but that's not the ultimate basis. And that's why sometimes people are puzzled by the continuing emphasis on China being a socialist country. In fact, one of the things that the Dalai Lama has been asked to accept is, the irreversibility of socialism in Tibet. Even though other people might say that it's been reversed elsewhere in the People's Republic of China. But the fact of the matter is that the theoretical underpinnings, and let me make this clear, the theoretical underpinnings within China still have to go back to this sort of Marxist dogma that nobody really likes to talk about because so many other areas of Marxist life have been, or Marxist thinking have been jettisoned. In other words, one is not going to opt for a solution which says, well, why don't we have a plebiscite or why don't we have a referendum in Tibet and let's see what people want. No, because this has been the decision of history with a capital H. Now, again, I have to say that this is largely ignored elsewhere. The other thing which I want to say about history, having said that, the view of history from Beijing is that, and I hope this is not too arcane, is that Tibet has been a part of China ever since the 13th century. That is, ever since the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty was the dynasty established by the Mongols after the conquest of China. And this is basically the view that Tibet has been a part of China ever since the Yuan dynasty. The only problem with that formulation is that when you begin to look at it, and this is something which I've done, it's actually a very recent view. This is not the view propounded during the Yuan dynasty. It's not even the view propounded during the Ming dynasty, even the Qing dynasty. It's basically a 20th century view of things. In the first half of the 20th century, when you start to look at documents from the Republican period, and even some writings that come out of the very early 1950s in the People's Republic of China, The general sense was that Tibet had become a part of China during the Qing dynasty. That is, the dynasty of the Manchus, 1644 to 1911. There'll be an exam at the end of the presentation. And even there, it's not as if the establishment of the Qing automatically made Tibet a part of China. The basic idea that you find is that, in the period following the Gurkha War in the 1790s, and Qianlong's mandated reform of Tibetan affairs with his point-by-point list of what needs to be done. It's at that point that Tibet becomes a part of China, so approximately 1792. The other interesting thing about this is the term that is often used for Tibet's association with China now is inseparable. Tibet is an inseparable, integral, either it's an integral part of China, it's an inseparable part of China. This formulation, of course, makes it seem as much a part of China as any other province or anything. But the interesting thing is, in the 20th century, the term that was used was fanshu, which really is a term which denotes a feudal dependency. It doesn't denote an integral part of a country, but rather something which derives from the age of empire. It's anything but an integral part of China. And indeed, in the early 20th century, when you find a number of memorials from Qing officials as to how to deal with Tibet, there are a couple of them which raise the interesting points that the court ought to deal with Tibet the way ought to shape its relations with Tibet. It ought to have a relationship with Tibet which is the same as the French relationship with Vietnam, the American relationship to the Philippines, or the British relationship to Australia. In other words, this is basically a colonial view. Now, you have to understand, of course, that in the early 20th century, empire was not a bad word. To have a big, strong empire was felt to be a very, very good thing. So there was nothing embarrassing about saying that this should be a part of our empire. And of course, the way one looks at this, it is indeed feasible to say, well, yes, indeed, it was an empire. And in fact, if you look at most works on China before the, before 1949, I mean, the Qing state was called an empire. In fact, if you look at most works now, people still refer to it as an empire. The Qing Empire, or the Manchu Empire, in fact. Now, this is all very interesting. At the same time, I have to make the point that the Tibetan exiles, the Tibetan government in exile has often broached, there's been some nuance, some greater nuance in their views, but they've often broached the position that Tibet was entirely independent throughout its history, and that the only relationships that colored this were what are called priest-patron relationships. That is to say, that Tibetan hierarchs had relationships of master and disciple with imperial rulers. Perhaps most famously the Sakya hierarch Pagpa and Kublai Khan, in the 13th century, et cetera, et cetera. And the position on the part of some exiles and some other writers who've written from that point of view is that this, shall I say, innocent, innocuous spiritual relationship has been misinterpreted as denoting some sort of political subordination. And so this is the view that you have there, which unfortunately is not really tenable. In fact, the Chinese response to this has been to say that this is completely separate from political subordination and does not mean that Tibet was not subordinate to the various dynasties. And indeed, that basically is the case, because you do find a relationship between Tibetan hierarchs and emperors during the period of Mongol rule, during the Yuan dynasty, but then you also find it during the Ming rule, when there is no subordination of Tibet to any court in Beijing, whether it's Chinese or other. And then you also find this same sort of relationship between various lamas and the emperor during the Qing dynasty. Now, I bring up this intermediary Ming dynasty simply to make the case that you can't really go on the basis of any sort of continuity from Yuan to Ming to Qing if you're talking about the subordination of Tibet to China, because there was no subordination during the Ming. But more interestingly, and here's where it really gets spicy if you're taking notes. The Yuan dynasty, which was the dynasty that was ruled by the Mongols, never made Tibet a part of China. the UN rulers basically saw themselves as Mongol rulers. They saw themselves as rulers of a greater Mongol empire. This was certainly Kublai Khan's view of things, although there were contenders, certainly. And there was not a unified empire by the time that he was ruling. It wasn't the situation that it had been during the time of Genghis. But nevertheless, his aspirations and his view of himself was as the ruler of a greater empire, not simply as the emperor of China. The Yuan dynasty was the mechanism by which he ruled China. When you start looking at the dynastic histories, the official dynastic histories, the Yuanshi, the Mingshi, the Qingshi Gao, well, certainly the Yuanshi and the Mingshi, you can see that, and mind you, these dynastic histories quite useful. The Yuanshi was written just after the Yuan dynasty collapsed. So it is the least edited of them, and therefore in many ways extremely useful because it hasn't been re-edited and re-edited. But what you find there is that in the delineation, in the geographical delineation of the empire, the Dilijir, which forms the geographical delineation of the state in every one of these official dynastic histories, no Tibet. There's no Tibet. By the same token, when you look at the Mingshi, you find the same situation. Not that Tibet does not appear in the history, but not as part of the geographical delineation of the state. Relations with Tibet are certainly covered. In fact, in the Ming history, which was written by the Manchu rulers, the first draft basically had Tibet as a foreign country. The final draft had it as somewhere in the western regions. It was in the same area that Tamerlane and Samarkand and the Timurid Empire was. So this is anything but, how should I say, an integral part of China, so to speak. So this is basically the situation that we find in these histories, and it's quite interesting that when you get to this notion that Tibet became a part of China during the Yuan dynasty, during the Mongol period, looking in various articulations of that in the modern period, I'd say over the last 15, 20 years, you find different dates that are given as to when Tibet became a part of China. Very, very different dates which are given, and that's because there's no one document that attests to that because it never happened. There is no document in which the Mongols actually make Tibet a part of China. Now, the modern notion of this idea, Tibet becoming a part of China at a specific time, is very much in evidence. As I said, in the Republican period, the idea generally is that it became a part of China during the Qing period. And this is what writers say. Very, very bluntly, very, very clearly, became a part of China during the Qing period. We find this also in writings in the very beginning of the People's Republic of China, when they're trying to figure things out. Interestingly enough, in 1959, when you have this revolt in Tibet, is what ultimately leads to the Dalai Lama fleeing to India. In response to that, China publishes a volume called Concerning the Question of Tibet in order to make its case. And therein, it is simply said that Tibet was never independent, never ever. Now, I simply bring that up to show just how recent a construction it is, this idea of Tibet being a part of China ever since the Yuan dynasty. But this is the position from which we're operating now in terms of China's formulation of its relations with Tibet. And this is what Tibetans deal with and what Tibetans confront when they go against Chinese policy, when you have demonstrations, when you have protests in Tibet. Okay, I've been talking for most of my time now. I should just say that I was thinking about what I was going to talk about for some time, and then a couple of days ago came the news that the Dalai Lama had said that he was basically giving up on his efforts to have a negotiation with China on the future status. I think there's for the first time, I think there's a certain amount of realism which may be creeping into his thinking about Sino-Tibetan relations, if I may be so bold as to say that. Generally, it used to be that people would say that, well, you think that this is not going to work, that China basically has no interest in negotiating with the Dalai Lama, and that therefore he should adhere to the position that most Tibetans want, but that's unrealistic. The Dalai Lama is being realistic. This is what we were always told, that the Dalai Lama's position, which was, to wait for China to negotiate with him, was being realistic. Actually, I think right now is the first time that I think a little bit of realism is creeping into this. This position has been, again, I said history has a very big role to play in this. The Dalai Lama was consistently told, whenever he would say, I accept Tibet as a part of China, I accept that Tibet should be a part of China, he was told generally, and I'll simplify this, he was told, oh well, the Dalai Lama is not being sincere. He wants secret independence, or he wanted this or that, but he's not being sincere. The Dalai Lama has to, and this is very important, I think the Dalai Lama has to say that Tibet was not independent in the past. He has to say that historically Tibet was not independent. And again, this underlies this, teleological and almost dogmatic view of history. And so the Dalai Lama, of course, would say, well, we can argue about history. He said, I can't falsify history, but I accept that Tibet will not be independent, that Tibet will be a part of China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, he would be told, no, he has to accept that Tibet historically was not independent. And then sometimes they would add the codicil, oh, the Dalai Lama has to accept that Taiwan is a part of China, and various things. And the Dalai Lama would do this, and he would be told, no, he's not sincere. And then the Dalai Lama would say, oh, they don't understand me. China does not understand me. And this all worked very well. If I may add a little bit of my own view of the reality of the situation, because and in fact, this was noted in a Chinese paper on this a number of years ago, that part of the problem that China has always had in making its case has been that people tend to think that, oh well, if a Chinese official says something, then it's propaganda. It's propaganda, and this was in a little document in which it was said that what we need to do is cultivate foreign experts. Sort of get them over to our view, because no matter how brilliant a Chinese Tibetanist might be, if he were to say this, 1 minute left, no matter how brilliant he might be, nevertheless, he's going to be looked upon as a propagandist. And I should say I have a lot of respect for Chinese Tibetology. There's some very brilliant Chinese Tibetologists indeed. Well, China basically found, how shall I say, the star spokesperson, the Dalai Lama, because they would say, no, the Dalai Lama is being insincere. The Dalai Lama has to say this all sincerely. So Dalai Lama would go to George Bush, he would go to Bill Clinton, he'd go to Tony Blair, he'd go to Angela Merkel, say, I don't want independence, I don't want independence, I don't want. And as a result, the Dalai Lama effectively marginalized those Tibetans who, nonviolent as they are, would like to see an independent Tibet. That position has been marginalized. And in that respect, Chinese policy has been quite brilliant. And it's not, as the Dalai Lama said, that China doesn't understand him. They do understand him. I mean, when you add up the numbers of the people working in the foreign policy establishment, think tanks, nationality affairs, I mean, they're hefty numbers there. They parse every word that the Dalai Lama says. As I've said before, when it comes to the Dalai Lama, China knows what the meaning of the word is. However, in Dharamsala, their resources are in no way comparable, and as a result, they've more or less been led around by the nose, and I think that this might represent a sort of awakening to reality on the part of the Dalai Lama. So thank you. I've used up more time than I had a right to. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor. Our next presenter is Professor Carlson.
Right, well, Elliot, when you're covering however many hundreds of years of history, I think you probably get an extra minute or two to go through that. And I'm always so impressed by historians and the amount of detail with which you know the past. And I'm a political scientist, though, and in that sense, probably anything that took place more than the last news cycle is considered ancient history. Maybe not quite, but close to it. And I would say I acknowledge the importance of history in looking at the relationship between Tibet and China, but I don't think it's a determining factor, actually. I think a lot of the discussion, and Elliot's done a great job of kind of covering this contested terrain and highlighting how important it is to both sides as they attempt to articulate their positions on Tibet's current status and what it should be. I, in addition to being a political scientist, also need to confess that I'm not a Tibet specialist. I really work mostly on Chinese politics and more specifically China's foreign relations and questions of security in Asia. And I'd just note that in that sort of a context, that there is this real bifurcation of people who work on Tibet, who are Tibetologists, who know a great deal about the history of the region. And then those of us who work on China, who have tended to neglect, let's not just say Tibet, but minority policy in general. Really, there to date is still not a particularly good academic work, for example, on China's handling of minorities. I think there's work on looking at Tibet or looking at Xinjiang. There's work on cross-strait relations. What little I think I can add to possibly this conversation today would be in the spirit of looking at Beijing's behavior in Tibet as a policy issue, essentially, and describing to you briefly what I see as some minor variations, limited changes in Chinese policy over time, and argue that those changes have taken place sort of, I think, Elliot, at the kind of confluence of historical influences and interest-based calculations. So the bottom line would be that the Chinese leadership is, like most political leaderships, interested in maintaining their rule and does so in a way that they feel is essentially self-interested. I'm not an advocate of sort of rational choice approaches to politics, but I think that sometimes it's all too easy to paint China as some sort of communist monolith in which these horrible leadership that's bent on committing horrible atrocities. Not to say that they don't. We can look at our own leaders sometimes and maybe wonder what their political sort of orientations are, but rather that if we kind of pull back, I think, from some of the heated rhetoric on both sides, the normative question of what Tibet's status should be as part of China or separate, and look more at what China has done in its attempt to maintain control over Tibet, I think that perhaps you can see some interesting sort of, I think, kind of to and fro. I'm not going to say evolution, because I at one point maybe thought that there was some sort of progress, and actually you looking now at recent Chinese behavior, I think that there's been a move back towards a more sort of assertive, less flexible policy on Tibet. And one other sort of caveat, we know, or at least I know, very little about who actually is calling and who has we can do the who's on first thing, right? Who's actually calling the shots when it comes to Tibet policy, and more broadly when it comes to Chinese policy on any number of issues. How big is the PLA? I have friends who work on economic issues in Washington involved with China who tell me that they have no idea who's actually making decisions about currency and the rest. And these are people who are fairly well informed. So part of the difficulty then in making sense of Chinese behavior is that we just are simply operating with a real dearth of information. You kind of have to piece things together. That being said, I have spent a fair amount of time in Beijing over the years talking with, I guess what could be called semi-official sort of establishment intellectuals, people who brief the top leadership fairly consistently. And in those conversations, Tibet has come up fairly repeatedly. Mostly I've brought it up, and I've had, I think, actually interesting and not particularly politicized conversations where establishment scholars, and I won't name names, but people with some influence have said, well, as a thought experiment, what if we look at the cost and benefits of Chinese control over Tibet, the amount of economic subsidies which we place in the Tibetan region in a way to solidify rule, and is that actually a net positive? Is that something which China benefits from? Ultimately, they all said that making any real change is a non-starter because of fundamental sort of stories in China about the nature of the Chinese state and the sort of inability to imagine any other geographic spread other than having the chicken, right, with the two eggs, Hainan and Taiwan being one. I don't know if it's a chicken where Tibet is. Is Tibet a wing, maybe, then? I'm not sure. But anyhow, I do think it's important then to have a little bit of context. And when Mark initially called for this meeting, it was in the immediate aftermath of the March demonstrations. And I want to spend a little bit of time in detail on that Chinese behavior in March and April, actually. But first, I want to note that going back to 78, 79, that Beijing did, and many people, certainly my co-panelists, and I see people in the audience who I feel know much more about this than I do. So I'm a little bit, I feel a little bit humbled to call attention to this, but that at least in 78, 79 through about 82, Beijing did, if it didn't change its fundamental position on Tibet, Tibet's a part of China, it experimented with somewhat more liberal policies. And this, as is pretty well known, had two components. One was beginning to think about of talking to the Dalai Lama, albeit quite indirectly, and also introducing some very limited religious freedoms in Tibet. This is an acknowledgement of the sort of the bankruptcy of Cultural Revolution practices, and also part of an overall change in the Chinese leadership's approach to governing China. I think Tibet is a part of that. I want to emphasize, rather than getting into the specifics there, that I think that probably we overlook, in looking back to that period, just how much sort of political capital Deng had when it came to try, at least, out some minor variations in the theme of Tibet being part of China. He was, remember, going back to pre-49, that he's someone who had fought in the Southwest, in the frontiers. He had these military credentials. He also, by 80, 81, had basically total control of the party. He was someone then who had the ability to take some risks within the party on these sorts of policies, and also was doing so in a period where he had placed a priority on economic development and creating an image of China becoming a more stable, progressive sort of a power. So in that context, I think that he along with, at the time, his fairly close confederates, like Hu Yaobang in particular, experimented. And obviously we know that the outcomes of those policies were not productive from China's perspective. The idea was, by introducing a little bit of leniency, more legitimacy for Chinese rule would be gained, and everyone would live happily ever after. Anyone with even passing knowledge of the situation in Tibet realizes that actually the outcome went in the opposite direction. That these limited freedoms, accompanied by economic reforms, which brought Han Chinese into the region, stirred up resentments, created the space for the articulation of dissent, particularly in the monastic community, and then you get the 87 to 89 sort of uprising. But I do think again, looking back and thinking of this, of the leadership from Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, let's not forget that Deng, I don't want to call him a great man of history, and certainly not a tall man, right? His stature was quite diminutive. But that being said, someone who, because of where he was in the party, could play around with, could think about different options for reaching China's objectives in Tibet, which is solidifying control. And possibly, Elliot, thinking about what's kind of how to be hopeful or not hopeful, possibly that's kind of all that maybe Tibet can realistically hope for is some sort of, and Warren's in the audience, some sort of actual autonomy. And whether that can ever be guaranteed is a discussion that we could have. During the 90s then, I think what's of interest is after the 87, 89 clampdown and obviously the use of force to prohibit other subsequent demonstrations, that Jiang Zemin's policies basically were those of treading water. He didn't introduce any particularly inventive measures on the Tibetan Plateau. It was this balance of repression and probably a greater emphasis on economic subsidies than had been used before. I think also that Jiang is operating in a somewhat more constrained or circumscribed political sphere than Deng was in the 80s. This is at a period where leadership in China is becoming more collective. The individual, the paramount leader, has less ability to take real risks. And the point where I think that this comes across fairly clearly was in '98 during this the meeting between Jiang and Clinton in China, where Jiang, somewhat off the cuff at the end of a press conference, mentioned that he'd be willing to kind of push forward talks with the Dalai Lama. And there had been international pressure in that direction. We think of the context. This is getting towards the end game of China's push for a WTO agreement with the United States. So internationally, we can see reasons why China might compromise on Tibet as a way to garner what it wanted in other policy spheres. At the same time, that proposal ended up being a non-starter, and some, particularly in the Hong Kong press, have argued that Jiang actually had done it without consultation with the top leadership and didn't have to do a self-criticism as he did after the 95-96 crisis in the Taiwan Straits, but that that this was something that was out of sync with the way that decisions were being made in China during the Jiang Zemin era. I think that if you have more actors involved in China and need then at the top leadership level some sort of collective consensus, this tends then to push away from the possibility of a real breakthrough, particularly in the area of dialogue or discussion with the Dalai Lama. At the same time, I don't think it then necessarily is something which bodes poorly for China's Tibet policy. I think it leads then to precisely the sort of policies which took place in the 90s and right up through the start of this year, which was the sense that while things could have been better from Beijing's perspective, that things could have been better on the Tibetan Plateau, that at the same time the situation was under control. When we get to the spring of this year, it had been basically, 20 years or so since the last large-scale demonstrations. My sense from the year that I spent, 2004, 2005, was that the Chinese were exceedingly confident of how things stood in Tibet, that all the cards were really kind of on their side of the deck. I think that's how I'm not really a card player, and I always get in trouble. I actually, in a seminar just the other day, put a horse before the cart, which is how it's supposed to be, as opposed to a cart before the horse. But anyhow, sorry, tangential. What's been interesting then is in broader Chinese foreign policy, there's this argument that's been made over the past 5 or 6 years that Chinese nationalism is pushing Chinese behavior in a particular direction, right? And people will cite the Chinese response to the Belgrade embassy bombing or the 2005 spring demonstrations against Japan and its push to become a member of the Security Council. And I've felt actually that most of those arguments fall flat, that in fact nationalism has not been a particularly potent causal factor in pushing Chinese policy in one direction or the other. I believe, though, and I'm not wed to this conclusion, but looking fairly closely at what took place between March 14th and the Wenchuan earthquake in early May, I think you see a dynamic that shapes up where Beijing was left in a position of trying to catch up to nationalist sentiment that it had actually created itself, right? We know that Chinese nationalism is one of the clarions of the CCP after Tiananmen. It's nationalism and development. But I think this is one of the first times where this dynamic was beyond Beijing's control, and I think that's one of the reasons why the policy after the demonstrations ended up becoming so sort of totalizing and extreme. I'm not then talking, I don't feel that I know enough. What little I know is from listening to conversations by people like Robbie Barnett and other specialists about what took place between March 10th and March 14th. And there's obviously this discussion of why security forces didn't come out at a certain time and the rest, and people arguing perhaps because of the context of the NPC meetings and other things that the leadership was on top of it. I'm going to leave that aside. Maybe Lobsang actually could speak to some of that, I'm not sure. What I thought was extremely interesting was the fact that during March and April as well, that the type of sentiments that were expressed by Chinese nationalists on the web in regards to Tibetans were so extreme and so sort of, frankly, kind of hateful that I feel that you can then look at Beijing's own policymaking and see how they're kind of in a quandary. On the one hand, wanting to maintain an image of a responsible player in international politics, concerned about the upcoming Olympics, wanting to maintain a positive image, but on the other side, getting squeezed by this kind of genie which has been let out of the bottle of Chinese nationalist sentiment expressed in opposition to the Tibetan protesters, and outside of China in opposition to anyone who was not willing to toe the Chinese line on Tibet. And this took place both in cyberspace, on campuses around the country, including in Ithaca, and it led to this supercharged period, actually in debates about Chinese politics that I hadn't seen since I was an undergraduate during Tiananmen, which betrays my age a little bit. I turned 40 this year, so I don't know if that makes me old or young. I guess it depends where one sits on the 40 line, right? But what I want to refer to is a couple of these blog sort of postings. And some of these, there was a report from Reuters that tracked this very nicely, and also the Berkeley China Internet Center has some good tracing. One of the difficulties in using internet sources is trying to figure out how representative they are. I'm actually in the midst of a larger research project which is trying to use new methods coming out of the field of internet studies to do something that's more rigorous in terms of sampling and the rest of it. But for now, all you had to do was have a server that had Chinese language software, and in March you could see that this was a wave of real strong expression of nationalism, which again, I think went beyond what Beijing would have liked to see. This was not something where Beijing was stirring this up. This is where Beijing was being boxed into a bit of a corner. One thing that struck me in particular, and I mentioned this on a couple of listservs that I'm on, was between March 16th and 17th, the #1 video on YouTube was this insane anti-Tibetan sort of screed that made the Chinese white papers look exceedingly moderate. It was extremely, it was crudely made and particularly harsh and very blunt, attacking the Dalai Lama. And for one thing, it was #1 on YouTube, and I don't know who it would be interesting who the viewers were. I'm not sure if people, because they were just, when they were searching, were coming up with the term Tibetan, this came up, but it was there. And some of the blog postings, one that was on the Berkeley site, tracked on the Internet Center, said, quote, Dalai Lama, I don't believe any of the bastards who say you didn't start this. What is it about you lying down in your coffin that makes you crave public enemy status? And that's just one small sample. Beijing then, I think it was right around this time that Beijing began, for the first time, to label, for example, the Tibetan Youth Congress as a terrorist organization. From 9/11 onwards, obviously, to label a group as terrorist has been the best way to give yourself carte blanche in terms of how you treat that group. And the Chinese had not gone down that road, realizing that it was probably a bit of a dead end. It's a little bit hard to portray the Dalai Lama, who has obviously attained incredibly high, we could say Q ratings, for example, in the West, as a terrorist. And even at this point in time, Beijing didn't go quite that far, but talking about the TYC as a terrorist organization was an example, I think, of how backed into the corner Beijing felt by some of this sentiment. I then believe that if it hadn't been for the Wenchuan earthquake, which I think was May 12th, that this dynamic would have carried on right up through the games. And in a way, obviously a tragic event, an enormous loss of life. But Beijing kind of dodged a bit of a bullet in the aftermath of the earthquake, the global and Chinese-specific anti-Tibetan sentiments died down, and the focus was on national mourning, and this then transitioned into the Olympic period. Because of the fact that I think that who and when are even more in a position of being part of a collective leadership as opposed to having singular power over decision-making, especially on a contentious issue like Tibet, I think they're unlikely then to make major compromises when it comes to negotiations with the Dalai Lama. And because of this underlying sentiment of Chinese nationalism, I think there is continually a potential for there to be backlash against any actions which Tibetans take in Tibet to express their opposition to Chinese rule. And I want to emphasize that I don't think that the backlash would be orchestrated by Beijing. I think actually Beijing would be very happy to see the Tibet issue just to be a quiet one, not only because of the risks it poses for them in Tibet, but because how this can then spiral out of control with reference to Chinese nationalist sentiment both in China and abroad. And for a regime that right now is or a state that is particularly intent on portraying itself as a responsible power, trying to offset some of the general concerns in the international sphere over China's rise, portraying China's rise as being that of any past rising power, anything which upsets that is an unwanted outcome. And I guess to that degree, because of that broader concern, I would assume that Beijing will continue to engage in at least the facade of negotiations or discussions with the Dalai Lama. But frankly, the policy there, it strikes me, has been for a number of years, the sense that that with the Dalai Lama's increasing age, that Beijing will be in an even stronger position, lacking such a charismatic figure on the Tibetan side. That calculus strikes me as wrong for a number of reasons, and I think Lobsang probably would know more about this than I do, but I think it's mistaken. One other thing that's interesting to note, in light of the fact that it's sort of required to talk about the financial crisis in light of because it's taking place right now outside our very door. I guess one possibility, if you want to think, just to throw in a wild card, is if the global economy gets so bad that it really begins to have a direct impact on China's economy. We know that Beijing basically has to maintain around an 8% GDP growth rate in order to continue to absorb new entrants in the labor market. Rand has talked about this for a number of years now. One could posit that if there was a global downturn that was really broad and sweeping, perhaps this would push new policies in Tibet. Maybe Beijing would get tired of all the money it's pumping in there. So that the silver lining could be, well, none of us have retirement accounts anymore. Maybe there's room for progress or openings on the Tibetan Plateau. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Professor. Our final presenter is Dr. Sangay.
I chose to be the third speaker now as Elliot and Alan. Is it?
I think it's off. You want mine?
Deliberately or?
Yeah, we'll try this silence.
I think so, yeah. Okay, it's clear. I deliberately chose to speak the third. Now, after listening to Elliot and Alan, I kind of regret it because they spoke most of the things that I wanted to say. So I was thinking, what else can I add to the conversation? Then I thought maybe I can relate Tibet to Obama. That will make just spice things up, because now if all the pundits and polls are correct, depending on which one you pick, the Iowa one or the New Hampshire one, during the Democratic primary, one proved to be right and the other proved to be wrong. If Obama is elected as the next president of America, that I think will be revolutionary. I think it will shock the world. And it will shock me too. Because I was thinking to myself, slavery ended in 150 years ago. Martin Luther King made the speech, "I have a dream." 45, it's okay. I'm talking Martin Luther King, you don't want to listen? Martin Luther King made the famous speech, "I have a dream," 45 years ago, and the Civil Rights Act was passed 43 years ago. And in 1969, there were just, I think, six members of African American in the Congress. Now you have 43 members, right? Now take the same time frame. Though historically, of course, African Americans and Tibetans have different context, background. So take the same time frame. Tibet was occupied in 1951 or 59, right? So 6 years after Tibet was occupied by China, America is on the verge of electing an African American as president. Now, if you look at the situation in Tibet, now can we ask this question in China? Can a Tibetan become a next president of China or a premier of China? One could say it's impossible, right? If you look at the US administration for the last 20, 30 years, at least there has been one or two minorities in the cabinet. You have Condi Rice as the Secretary of State, and I think Guterres, if I'm to pronounce his name right, is the Secretary of Commerce, and Ellen Chang, I think she's the Labor Secretary, right? Chang, yeah. Labor Secretary, three of them. Now compare that with China. You have 27 or so ministers, no one is minority, except for the head of the minorities department, who is Mongolian. In the US Congress now, the majority whip, James Clyburn, right? He's the third most powerful person in the Congress, is an African American. And Charles Rangel from New York, he's the chairman of the most powerful committee, appropriation committee in the Congress. Compare that with Tibetans in the National People's Congress. Some will say it's a rubber stamp of the Chinese government. There's some interesting debate going on. Even then, only one Tibetan becomes the vice chair of National People's Congress. But what is not said is that there are 20 plus vice chairmen, and the executive vice chairman is often Han Chinese. Right? Now, even at the cabinet level, the 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, no minorities. 25 members of the Politburo, no minorities, right? At least in the US you have. So now, now if you, and then if you look at the situation in Tibet Autonomous Region or Tibetan areas in Sichuan, Gansu, Yunnan Province, I think it's worse. For example, in the last 50 plus years, the party secretary of Tibet Autonomous Region, the most powerful person, has never, ever been a Tibetan. Not just that. In the standing committee of the Politburo of the Tibet Autonomous Region, out of 15 members, right, 8 are Han Chinese. Among the 7 Tibetans, 2 are half Chinese, and 3 or so are married to Chinese. And then if you look at the governing council, the governor is Chambil Gyatso, the Champapinzo, but the deputy governor is always Han Chinese. If you look at the local congress, now almost it's in increasing trend, almost 50% of the local congress, even the bureaucrats are Han Chinese. And of course, no one from the Tibetan is in the Chinese Supreme Court, right? At least in the US, you have a controversial figure, Clarence Thomas. Why I say this, of course, one could say, it's not relevant. Mark's cousin, I heard, Jerry Cohen, will say, don't compare American democratic theory with reality in China. But I'm comparing reality in America with reality in China. Right? Since 43 years of Civil Rights Act, so much of changes have happened for African American. I'm not saying everything is all right, definitely not. But the trajectory of African American, at least the political representation in the US government, has been on the upswing. As for Tibetans, is going down. Of course, zero at the national level. Even at the local level, it's going down because even the Communist Party members, cadre, 45,000 or so of Tibet Autonomous Region, increasingly they are Chinese. Now, according to Andrew Fisher, he collected data till 2002, 50+% of the cadre are Han Chinese in Tibet Autonomous Region, right? So now, why I say this is because Alan mentioned why the uprising happened. There are different theories. Obviously, one major theory is that, which I tend to subscribe, is that not just Tibet issues has not just the identity issue now. It has crossed the threshold of bread and butter issue. Once you mix the two, it's volatile. It will explode. That's what happened because of economic marginalization of Tibetan people, cultural assimilation, and political repression. And that's why there was uprising in March and April in Tibet. Now, there is a past president. In 1959, too, there was uprising. 87, 88, 89, there were uprisings. Now, there are correlations between dialogues not working and leading to uprising. Because in 1951, the local Tibetan government, exile as per the Chinese government and the central government of China, signed 17-point agreement, right, through dialogue. But the Chinese government did not implement most of the provisions of the 17-point agreement, and hence partly led to the 1959 uprising. Now, as Alan mentioned, in early 80s, the liberal leader Hu Yaobang led or made efforts to introduce liberal policies in Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibetan areas, as well as have dialogue with the representative of Dalai Lama. But Hu Yaobang fell out of power. It did not lead anywhere. And because the dialogue fell through, 87, 88, 89 uprising happened. Now, as for 2008, since 2002, 8 meetings have taken place between the Chinese and Tibetan government, right? And there is no breakthrough whatsoever. Hence, there was uprising in March and April of 2008. So there is a correlation between dialogues not working with uprising. So which means, and I'm sure historians will also subscribe with me here, looking at the past president, it will happen in the future. So the uprising, even violent ones, is, though unfortunate, is inevitable. You know. So actually, I'm supposed to make a PowerPoint presentation. It should be so because they spoke most of the things. Then I'll just update you on where are we now. So can we have? Is it on? So update you where are we now. Then briefly show you discuss about what can be done next. Just again bringing Obama and Tibet back together. China wants to, let's say, emulate at least the good part of America. China wants to be like powerful nation like America, but maybe China can try to emulate some good things, some positive things about America as well. That is respecting and implementing the principles of equality, freedom, and justice as far as African American representation in the U.S. government. Similarly, hopefully, the Chinese government will follow about Tibet as well. Now we will go to the third slide here. Where are we now? Much ado about nothing, because Dalai Lama has said that he's losing hope as far as Chinese government is concerned. However, as a matter of principle, he still believes in the middle path as the most practical, formula. Dalai Lama has said that he's losing hope as far as Chinese government is concerned. However, as a matter of principle, he still believes in the middle path as the most practical, formula or solution, and he still has hopes with Chinese people, because some have shown interest and even some expressed support and have written letters about it. So he still has hopes with the Chinese people, but losing hope with the Chinese government. Next. This is actually, I'm not quoting him now, actually. I'm quoting him. He made the same statement on 18th of July to a Hong Kong newspaper called Ming Pao. So what he said just 2 days ago is not new. What's next now? What will happen to Tibet? I titled it "Waiting for Godot." If you are familiar with Samuel Beckett's drama, two people keep talking, they wait for someone, the Godot, to come, it never comes. So I don't know whether it will be Samuel Beckett's play or it will be Macbeth's play. The to be or not to be, that's the dilemma for Tibetans now, to be with the dialogue or not to be with dialogue. And that's what we are going to discuss in November 17th to 22nd, because as you know, Dalai Lama has called a special meeting where 500 to 600 Tibetans from all walks of life will gather in Dharamsala and discuss the next strategy, if there is one, on what to do. However, the 8th delegation is scheduled to go to Beijing at the end of the month, literally at the end of the month, and they are supposed to exchange views about autonomy, and I'll share what those views could be from what I know. So in Dharamsala meeting, people will discuss crisis in Tibet and the future of the Tibetan movement. Very small topics and very small responsibility, but Tibetans will be doing their best. Now, Tibet, what has happened so far, the latest issue because, Melvin Goldstein says Tibet is not a human rights issue, it's an ethnic issue. And I would like to say now, it is not an ethnic issue, it's a legal issue. Because why? Dalai Lama I think if you just click one, Dalai Lama in 2006, March 10, 2006, he made it very clear that he wants to resolve the issue within the framework of the Chinese constitution. So that means now it's a legal case, but ironically, within the framework of Chinese rule of law, whatever that is, right? So we go to the next phase. Now, how do you define genuine autonomy? There are the several interpretations. One is, as you know, Tu Xiaoming, he is the head of the Tibetology Center. He wrote a very well-read piece in the Jiushu, it's an influential journal, saying that socialism as an ideology and Communist Party as an institution and minority nationality law as the basis of autonomy. These are the three principles on which they cannot compromise. And if you have read the piece, a column by Nicholas Kristof in New York Times recently, 2 columns actually, where Dalai Lama essentially said he accepts socialism as an ideology, a Communist Party as an institution, and the minority law as a basis for autonomy. So I mean, now what else Dalai Lama can say, right? He has been as conciliatory as he could be. Essentially, he's saying, I accept everything what you're saying, but I want you to implement it, So the dispute is about implementation now. Now, what is the implementation and the, I think next yeah. See, this is, I think, now the 8th delegation, when they go, if they're actually allowed to come by the Chinese government, then the discussion will be, I think, some question needs to be asked. This is my, again, interpretation, right? How do you define right to administer their internal affairs and its adherence to principle equality? How you interpret this, What does it mean? Can Tibetans administer the internal affairs? So I think they will seek interpretation from the Chinese government, what exactly it means. And another provision for discussion could be this one, because essentially this says that the autonomous prefectures and counties can amend laws, but has to seek approval from the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. What does it mean? Is it automatic? Of course, if Tibetans wants to interpret or amend some laws, then when you seek approval, is it automatic? Because at the provincial level, they can amend laws. Then the approval is automatic. They just have to report to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress and automatically approved. But as for minorities, you have to seek approval. How do you define that? You have to have a stamp of approval, or someone will come from the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress and say this looks okay. So the procedural matter, So that interpretation, I think, has to be sought. Otherwise, if this is not clarified, if this is interpreted strictly, then I think autonomy that it is written in the Chinese Constitution and Minority Nationality Act does not mean anything. Because when you try to implement it and interpret it, amend it, if the Standing Committee does not approve it, or delay it, then you simply cannot do anything. Another article of interest could be Tibetan language in the public sector, because the provision says the Tibetan language or the minority language has to be encouraged and used as a medium of communication in the public sector, but it's not implemented now. And how you interpret it, how you implement it. The third one is demarcation and definition of Tibet. This is very important for Tibetans. The Chinese government says that, well, it's impractical to redemarcate Tibetan areas as one administrative region. 2, it's historically incompatible. And 3, legally impermissible. Now, if you go to the next phase, I would like to show, as a lawyer, the Article 4 of the Chinese Constitution and Article 12 of Minority Nationality Act of 1984 clearly says the autonomous region can be established wherever there are minorities in concentrated communities, right? Now, I think next phase, yeah. So next slides. Next slides. Now, again, there are many critics of China who says China has no rule of law. But again, they have one shining example where Chinese government has really implemented their law to the word of the provision, and this is it. Now, as per the Article 4 and 12 of the Constitution and Minority Nationality Act, they have established 5 autonomous regions, right? Zhuang Autonomous Region, as you can see, has 95% of the Zhuang minority live in Zhuang Autonomous Region. Xinjiang Autonomous Region, again, 95+% of the Uyghur live in Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And Mongolians, they are scattered in 4 provinces, but nearly 70% of the Mongolians live in Inner Mongolians, and they have established 1 autonomous region. And the other Mongolians who are scattered in Xinjiang and Tibetan areas, especially in Qinghai, they are geographically separated. Hence, they are separate. Otherwise, if they're geographically together in concentrated community, they are permitted to have autonomous region. Ningxia, as we all know, which are scattered in 10 provinces, but Ningxia is like a serpentine shape, it's like a snake. But the gerrymandering is implemented so well in China, they really carved out a Ningxia autonomous region for Hui people. That's because they were really, Chinese government was implementing the word of the law. There are minorities, concentrated community, let's make, and province. Now, Tibetans, they are in concentrated community, as you saw in the map. The Tibetans in Gansu, Yunnan, Sichuan, and Qinghai, and Tibet Autonomous Region are in same topography, same weather, even same animal, yak, roaming around, right? But they are divided into 5 different areas. Now, this is in violation of the Chinese Constitution, Article 4 and Article 12 of the Minority Nationality Act. So Tibetans, when they say Tibetans want single administrative region, they are not asking any special favor from the Chinese government. They're simply requesting, please implement your law. Please grant Tibetans what you have already granted to Xinjiang and Zhuang. Now, I mean, at least we are entitled to have that much, right? Tibetans, at least, if you believe equality and fairness is to be believed. Now, again, the Chinese government argument is that, well, the Dalai Lama government never controlled areas beyond Tibet Autonomous Region. Khams were rebel and Qinghai, the Muslim warlord controlled area, so never controlled. Yes, the argument could be made on that basis. But then, Xinjiang government never controlled the area. Mongolians never controlled the area. Zhuang never controlled the area. Zhuang noble family actually never controlled beyond the village they were in, right? Xinjiang, 1945 to 49, their government did not control much beyond the surrounding area. And in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, so many fiefdoms. Ulanfu, the first, leader of the Communist Party, he was also labeled as the king of Mongolians, right? Who done favors by Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping to expand the area of Mongolia beyond the areas where Mongolians were living, actually. So actually they got more than what actually is the interpretation. And whereas they are Chinese and, they are Chinese convert to Islam or some Central Asian descent, but they never had a government as such. Again, comparatively, as testified by, or presented by, I should say respectfully, Elliot Sperling, Tibetans had the strongest government of all the governments, if you go back to a century or even 1,000 or so years of history. So again, it's a violation of history as well. If you go back to 7th and 8th century, Tibet expanded all the way to China and South Asia, so Tibetans are not asking that much, but at least wherever Tibetans are living should be as one unit. Next. Now, it's impractical. You can't divide. Now, you can't redemarcate Tibetan area. What happened to Xinjiang Autonomous Region happened in the 60s, and yes, that's a logical argument, but then contradictory, because if you look at 1984 to 94, the Chinese government created 47 autonomous counties and prefectures, right? And as recently, it's been quite recently, the Chongqing municipality was carved out of Sichuan province, right? And I think Henan province was upgraded, or redemarcated from Guangdong and upgraded as a province. So, when it comes to Han Chinese government has gone out of its way to avail any possible demarcation and redemarcation, and hopefully Chinese government will look at Tibet issue as valid and it's practical, as implementable. So next phase here. And conclusion, I think I just wrote this up. Well, if China, as we all know, their international affairs slogan is peaceful rising. China wants to rise peacefully, and we all are for it because China wants to be a great nation. I think China deserves to be a great nation. I think so. But the greatness cannot be forced or bought. You have to earn it, I think. And in that sense, actually, how China treats Tibet will partly determine the legacy and the future image of China. I hope, because I'm involved in organizing conferences or track to initiative, inviting Chinese scholars from China to Harvard University. Almost every year I've been doing it. I've organized 6 conferences so far. And I'm sure many of Americans here, when you interact with Chinese friends, they often, when you mention Tibet, they often come around and say, you Americans, how you treated African Americans and Native Americans, right? I hope the Chinese people will not use this guilt-stricken defensive mechanism, Rather, they'll turn around and say, you Americans got it wrong. We'll show you how it needs to be done properly. Look at Tibet, This is the way to do it. I hope China will rise up, be a great nation, and claim the mantle of 5,000 years of civilization and treat Tibetans in a civilized manner. And as Dalai Lama has shown, and he's willing till date to be as conciliatory as possible, even though he's losing hope. The 8th delegation is going literally at the end of this month, and hopefully the Chinese government will rise up as a great power and show to the world a model on how to treat minorities. And we Tibetans don't expect to be the next president of America or China, but Tibetans do expect to be their own leader of their own region, as stipulated in the white papers of China and the Chinese Constitution and Minority Nationality Act of China. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Right now, let us open the floor to Q&A. So for those of you who have been to our events, it's pretty straightforward. Please wait for the mic to get to you. And then afterwards, please identify your name and your affiliation. And please be brief and concise when you ask your questions or make your comments. Thank you. Okay, so let's just take this gentleman in front first.
Thank you. Charlton, Bethesda, Maryland. I have 2 questions for Professor Carlson. First one is this. You mentioned about China pump lots of money to Tibet, but I didn't get what you say. I didn't get what the so-called established scholar either comment or criticize that to you. And second is this, Chinese have a special policy to deal with unrest. And as my information, Tibet have lots of practice on it. But in the May, you mentioned the May 10 to 14, March. And the Tibet authority is very slow to react. And I don't know, do you know, did the Tibet authority get some criticism and punishment from the central government? So my question are twofold. One is why the Tibet authority is slow react, and second is this: did central government did something to the Tibet authority? And thirdly, I want to comment is this: you mentioned about the early May earthquake, and actually, as I know, the people in the area are minority. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, because to clarify the comment I made about some of the discussions I've had with foreign policy specialists in Beijing. So these are people at some of the major think tanks and research institutes, and the comment that a couple of them made was that if you think about Chinese national interest and consider the balance between the economic flows which have gone into Tibet, which all sides acknowledge have taken place, how much of a positive influence they've had on life and the quality of life on Tibet is open to discussion, but that it's an empirical fact that China has put a lot of money into infrastructure projects in Tibet. The question which was raised by some of these, again, fairly influential, two influential scholars, was if that poses a major drain on the Chinese economy, at what point should Beijing begin to rethink the rationale behind doing that? If it's a bottomless pit and if it doesn't buy legitimacy, then is it perhaps worthwhile to think about maybe letting Tibet go, with the acknowledgement that that's not going to happen? But as a thought exercise, it was interesting at the very least. Okay. And I think what it does show is that, and we oftentimes treat the Chinese state as if it's monolithic, and I think it's extremely important to realize that there are a diversity of views, not just among sort of dissident scholars, but people fairly close to the inner circle. The problem, though, is, and I'll repeat this, and despite the fact that Lobsang did a great job of telling us about the formal structure of the Chinese state, what's still somewhat more difficult to get inside is the informal structure and how decisions are actually made. And this speaks directly to your second set of questions. I have no idea what sort of repercussions have taken place. I think we could look to media reports. Some people who spend a lot of time on the ground in Tibet, I think, have bits and pieces of this story. And obviously the major questions are, one, why did the demonstrations begin? Why was there a hesitation between putting them down? And then after the initial demonstrations were stopped, why was there this basically a 24-hour period between when the Tibetans reacted against the initial Chinese show of force and the destruction of largely property within Lhasa that was directed against Chinese, and actually Hui as well? I think one can surmise that this left Beijing particularly unhappy, and I would imagine that some heads have rolled, and I think there have been some resignations and sackings. But again, I think one of the things that China can do if it wants to become a responsible power, a major power, is continue down the path of transparency. And it's done so in some areas, other areas which I know more about, including actually the PLA. And the more that can be done in that regard, I don't think necessarily the outcome will be that which a lot of Tibetans would like to see, because ultimately, and then I'll stop, Elliot framed the discussion as a historical one, Lobsang as a legal one. I think it's a political one, and from that perspective, the spectrum of solutions is pretty narrow, and the outcome is pretty obvious, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Let's go to the very back, the lady with the orange.
Hi, Betty Lin of the World Journal. The question is for Lobsang, but other panelists are welcome to chime in. Could you tell us the timing of the Dalai Lama's speech Saturday, and also the impact of his speech to this week's dialogue? And did he make any new points other than his interview to Mingbao in July? And also, how would the eighth round talk, the results of that impact the upcoming special meeting in Dharamsala in November? And will Lodi propose the autonomy proposal to the Chinese this time? Thanks.
I don't think he said anything different compared to Ming Pao's interview and the statement he made in July. Just 2 days ago. It's an annual event. There's a Tibetan Children's Village. Annually he goes there and then he makes a kind of normally inspirational talk to children to, focus on your education, studies, and then makes general statement or some policy statements on Tibet. This time he just reiterated what he said to Ming Pao. And also to other individuals, actually, he has been saying. So it's not a drastic changes, but it's just the Ming Pao, because it's Chinese, it's Hong Kong, not many people know about it. So because it came out in AP and others, and with the quite what we call sensational headlines, so people's like, I'm shocked and what's going on. So that way it's not that different. Now, will it impact the 8 delegation going to China? It depends on the Chinese government. But for the Chinese government, it's not a shocking news because they already knew about it since July. Even then, the 8 delegation was on till recently. Now, Lodi and Gesang Gansala, and they are in India now, and I think they are scheduled literally to go at the end of this month. So till it's no go, they're going to go. Now, because in the last meeting, the discussion was in the 8th meeting. Now, they will exchange views on autonomy. So from the Tibetan side, I think this time they will present how they interpret autonomy. And you can go through the list of Minority Nationality Act and Chinese Constitution, all the provisions. But I think some of the key provisions I think are important are these provisions. And of course, you can go through all the list. So I'm sure the Chinese government also will come with their interpretation of autonomy or implementation thereof in Tibet Autonomous Region, other areas. Now, I think what I'm looking for is from the reaction from the Chinese government. When they get the proposal from the Tibetan side, if Chinese government says, well, you got it wrong, you didn't understand this, oh, it's not in good faith, or there's some hidden agenda, all that, right? Then, I think Dalai Lama, he's rightfully losing hope, and he's entitled to lose hope, right? But rather the discussion is, well, this is good. Now, finally, we are seeing something within the framework of the Chinese Constitution. This is tight-knit. There's nothing hidden agenda, right? Now, we can make progress here. Let's issue a joint statement saying Tibet is an issue we want to deal with and in the future. And from now on, it's not so quote-unquote dialogue of official or quote-unquote unofficial meetings. Rather, now, next step is there's a breakthrough. Now, this is real negotiation we're going to have on the framework of what is presented. Then I think that's a sign of progress, Even then, that could be a lip service for next round to come. But this time, I think, as I said, I have been a proponent of dialogue all these years. Very, very few Tibetans organizes conferences, inviting Han Chinese from China to Harvard, and then inviting Chinese scholars. My friend Tashi, she also participates sometime, and Elliot has come. I try to invite anyone possible. It is a very difficult time. I can assure you that half of my gray hair is because of organizing these conferences. The Chinese refuse to come initially because they think it's an entrapment to insult them, right? Tibetans don't want to come because they don't want to shake hands with the enemy. Westerners, they don't want to come, because they don't want to be caught in this crossfire between Chinese and Tibetans spitting at each other, That's the image. And Harvard, though encouraging and generous, and they literally say, Lobsang, we are behind you, literally behind you, not with you, So I've been just pulling this, what do you call, card for the last so many years. Even I can say now, because I've talked to many Chinese people, I said, look, I do this, but many Tibetans are saying, it's useless, it's futile. They also say this dialogue with the Solinist representative is just waste of time. They're just dragging time, right? And many of my Chinese friends assured me at the very beginning, this can't be. The first dialogue is happening, second, third, no Chinese government. The fact that it's happening is encouraging. And I said, what if it turns out, futile or useless or endless? They say it can't be. Now I'm yet to follow up with a question. Now, what do you say after 8th round? In fact, it's the 9th round, This is the 9th meeting. Because now I think our delegation wants to minimize meetings, right? They call it 8th, even though they met one in July, They call it, it's not a dialogue, it's a meeting of sort, It's the 9th meeting, and there is no end in sight, and we can't go on like this forever, Not in the sense we want a solution to be found in the 8th meeting, but at least an acknowledgement of the Chinese government that Tibet is an issue we want to deal with.
Second row.
Richard Selden, I'm a freelance writer. This question is for Mr. Sangay and Mr. Sperling, but raised by Mr. Sangay's analogy between progress of blacks in the United States and the lack of that of Tibetans. When Jiang Zemin came to visit the United States, he said to the Congress that our liberation of Tibetans was very similar to your liberation of blacks in the Civil War. Now, many people in Congress were shocked by that. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand the Tibetan situation very well. Could you talk, not obviously this is a long discussion, but could you talk a little bit about that issue? To what extent were Tibetans serfs or slaves or indentured or in a problematical status before, according to the Chinese, they were liberated in 1951?
First of all, the general situation of Tibetans prior to 1950, 1951. First of all, it varies across the plateau. You're talking about people who lived in the area under the Dalai Lama's jurisdiction, under the government of the Dalai Lama, under that jurisdiction, and those who lived under various other jurisdictions, including those of local rulers in Kham and Amdo. Which, by the way, if I can digress, I adhere to my 20 minutes, so let me give you another minute. If I can digress here with regard to this whole business of combining Tibetans into one large or autonomous region. This goes back to one of the things that I said before about this, the continuation of certain Marxist ideas as if by inertia, because there's nothing else to replace them. I'm not saying that this is, the logical reason why this should be, but when the Chinese government talks about not putting Tibetans all into one larger autonomous region, they do so largely on grounds that derive from Marxist ideas. That is to say, it doesn't matter that the people in all these areas are Tibetan. That's not really what matters because, let's face it, these are ephemeral, superficial characteristics. Is that their economic, social, and economic structures were fundamentally different. Now, I wouldn't say that they were that fundamentally different, but there was a certain difference. When China talks about the liberation of Tibetans in that respect, they're really talking about what is the Tibet Autonomous Region. This is what they're talking about specifically with regard to that. And the fact of the matter is that prior to 1950, 1951, I would not say that Tibet was an instinctual democracy. You had peasants who were bound, whether they're serfs or not. And I tend to think that, the use of the term serf is just, too specific to other societies and doesn't work here. But these were bound peasants. These were not, they were bound to estates. They were bound to lords. Now, the other part of it is that, and here I'm going to, I have to be very, very brief. I mean, I'm not going to give an entire semester course in this, but the fact of the matter is in the Tibetan Plateau, you had lots and lots and lots of land and very few people. And this was a mitigating factor, a tremendous mitigating factor. You had institutions such as human lease, where people could more or less agree to pay a certain tax and then go off wherever they wanted to go. In other words, their treatment, which was accorded to them, should not simply be understood on the basis of what the outward structure was, which is to say that during the same period within China proper, you had a huge population and little land, and the opportunities for exploitation were multiplied immensely because of that. So, just in terms of form, yes, this was this was not an egalitarian society. Okay, it was not an egalitarian society, but the portrayal of it as dark, cruel, barbarous, et cetera, is way off the mark as well. So in terms of that, the idea of liberation, one is going a bit far afield there. But then again, this is part of the narrative. This is the narrative that's being constructed. In other words, it's being constructed within a Marxist categories. And when I say that history is, what I see this as, I'm talking about specific issues. I'm not saying that you have to understand the policies because of history. I'm talking about the status of Tibet and the arguments about the status of Tibet. That really has to be understood through history, not so much the policies. But yes, in that sense, because their narrative is so invested in this idea of liberating the serfs, sometimes you put yourself into it so much it's very, very difficult to get out. And this is such a part of the narrative. And by the way, that narrative also surfaced in the wake of the demonstrations this past March, in the reaction and even in the internet reaction that you had from a lot of the Chinese students in the United States, where they would go to Chinese government websites and dredge up all these pictures of many of them, by the way, taken by British imperialists in Tibet, and put those to use to show the benighted nature of Tibetans.
For the sake of time, I'll just say, now I got an excuse. Now, Jiang Zemin said that their treatment of Tibetans is better than the American treatments of African Americans. Then I nominate myself as the next president of China. At least I have a credential. Obama is from law school, Harvard Law School. And I also graduated from Harvard Law School, So we have.
Did you edit the law review?
Pardon?
Did you edit the law review?
I did the Human Rights Journal. Does that? Yeah. So.
Any more questions? Let's go to the gentleman right here on the third row, and then afterwards the lady on the fourth row.
Thank you, sir. I'm Rajesh Kedi, and I'm a bit of a historian. Professor Sperling, you talked of the Qing dynasty. Now, since 1724, if I'm not wrong, there's an Amban who was stationed in Lhasa and in effect represented the temporal authority of the Manchus in Lhasa. Would you talk a bit about that? And the second is this ongoing question of who owns the hill tracts, the Tawang hill tract region, which the Lhasa government has always claimed, and now does the Lhasa government still claim while sitting in Dharamsala? Thank you.
Well, first of all, with regard to the Amban, it's fairly simple. This was the representative of Qing power within Tibet, and the status and functions of the Amban changed. At at first, when it was first established, it was essentially more of a representative office, but certainly by the end of the 18th century, it had far greater powers. Now, into the 19th century, particularly after the 1840s, the Qing ability to dominate Tibetan affairs declines, but the Amban remains there, and in some cases ineffectually, but structurally the Amban is the representative of Qing power and plays that role, representing the imperial power, not just representing it, but actually carrying it out as well later on within Tibet. I think it's fairly straightforward. With regard to Tawang, this is very interesting. The Tibetan government in exile, there may be some people who make some noises about that, but the Tibetan government in exile is not about to question, sitting in Dharamsala is not about to question the Sino-Indian border in Tibet. There's something very interesting, if I can just make a little aside. In 86 and 87 there was, and I recently wrote something about this, published something about this, there was a well-known clash actually in that area between Chinese and Indian forces, and after 86, 87 it died down. In 88, China published a volume in its series Rigne Logyu, cultural historical documents. They published an entire volume dedicated to that area, which of course is called Mönyu, the area of Mön, including the publication of a traditional Tibetan history of the area to give people a sense that this area is very, very profoundly connected with Tibet. And then another part of it had a lot of memoirs from people who had been there. There's also a brief historical survey. Chapet Setem Punso wrote that, a very important Tibet historian. But the interesting thing about it is that some of the memoirs come from people who were basically servants, or if you will, bound to Lalu Tsewang Dorji, whose family had estates on both sides of the frontier. And generally, and it was talked about how they would go and collect taxes. And generally, when I'm reading materials about the old society in which people are collecting taxes, I'm ready for them to be excoriated in such texts. And here I'm reading this, and I'm finding that they're actually greatly heroic people going out to collect those taxes in pre-1950 Tibet, because they're going to collect taxes south of the McMahon line. Then there are other things. The interesting thing about this is this volume was published in Tibetan. It was published in Chinese. Unlike materials that were published in the wake of the 1962 war, this was nothing was translated into English. It was as if the clash had passed, and they didn't want to stir it up with India by publishing these things in English, but they did want to do it to solidify feelings in the home front. So they made sure it was distributed in Tibetan and distributed in Chinese. I spoke about this actually at JNU in Delhi earlier this month. To my knowledge, nobody in India was ever aware of this publication. So,
can I just very briefly? I mean, I think one thing in terms of looking at the Sino-Indian border conflict and thinking about the prospects for dialogue and discussion, there's now been either 11 or 12 rounds of the border talks, and they haven't resolved the basic difference between New Delhi and Beijing over how territories should be distributed. But out of those talks, related to those talks, there have been a couple of confidence-building measures, CBMs, which have, I think, had a pretty profound impact on the nature of the Sino-Indian relationship. One of the things I think Beijing has made a mistake with, actually, both in dealing with Tibet and Taiwan, is insisting that CBMs can't be part of the discussion. You only do CBMs with another state, and therefore you can't talk about a confidence-building measure with whoever the representatives of the Dalai Lama be, or in cross-strait relations. I think that's beginning to change a tiny bit with Ma Ying-jeou's presidency in Taiwan, ways around it. But it strikes me that one possible avenue, a new avenue to consider, might be thinking about how to pursue confidence-building measures here, just as a bit of a wild card.
Lady in the fourth row.
I have a comment for the panel as a whole.
Can you identify yourself?
Tashi Rabgi. I direct Contemporary Tibetan Studies at the University of Virginia. So it seems to me that we're in the midst of a tectonic shift. And it's a challenge to narrate this moment. We're in the middle of it. And so I think the temptation is to take a fact or, a set of things that have happened and to, revert to our existing frameworks, whether as a historian or as a political scientist or as a lawyer, and try to fit it into what we already think is happening. But it might be that that snapshot doesn't fit into our frameworks, or that the frameworks always needed to be changed and certainly now need to be changed. One simple example of that, I think, is the hyper-nationalist response we saw on the internet on the Chinese side that we've heard about, and also on the Tibetan side. And I think that there's a second moment that's come out of this, right, in this moving frame, which is that now, for the first time, we have Chinese, scholars, philosophers, political scientists, and just citizens who are saying, my goodness, what is going on in Tibet that makes so many people react this way? And I don't think it is so simplistic that there's this madness that's monolithic. No, it's complicated. And one of the things that we've been doing through our nonprofit is tracking the conversation that's been going on in the Chinese language world in China. That is that second moment of thinking against the grain, against that hyper-nationalism. So that's one example. I think for this panel, the challenge that I'd like to put out there is to say maybe our framework of understanding China's Tibet policy, because I think what we've seen in all three discussions is a reduction of what that could be into China's policy on the Dalai Lama. When we do that, we play into the Chinese strategy since 1981, which is to define the Tibet problem, the Tibet issue, as the Dalai Lama. And in fact, the Dalai Lama is one extraordinary individual and institution that is just what it is, and the Tibet issue is much bigger. In fact, I think what we've seen in March is the spectacular collapse of China's Tibet policy. And I think to the extent that we don't have a lot of forums in the world to seriously think about the Tibet issue, we need to open up that space and to try to get as many more thinking, critically minded, Chinese public to expand their understanding of what the issue is. And it is not the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama and the dialogue issue is just one component of something much bigger that needs to be understood and talked about. And that includes getting the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet into the discussion. So, thank you.
I agree with Tashila, obviously. Because when hyper-nationalism happened, many people said, oh, it's Tibetans' fault. Some said Tibetans' fault, right? Because the uprising in Tibet, especially the pre-Olympics politics, led to this, But then the interesting that has happened is that there is enormous interest about Tibet among the Chinese students and scholars. Now, I was told by a Chinese friend that the best-selling book in China among Chinese students and scholars is Melvin Goldson's book. And I said, why? He said, look, Chinese were looking not for propaganda of Tibetan side or the Chinese government side. They were looking for a material which is kind of academic, but I have to be very careful now. I can't say pro, right? More somewhat, China-leaning or sympathetic to China, who understands Chinese view. So Melvin Goldson's book sells a lot. That's a progress. Again, I hope they will take next step and read Elliot's book and others' book as well. For example, recently Lori Gary gave a talk at Harvard Kennedy School, and half the audience was Chinese, actually. So it's very unusual. In that sense, Tibet has replaced Taiwan as the #1 issue as far as debate is concerned. Now, of course, unfortunately, it has become #1 out of tension or antagonism, right? But then when you have that kind of tension or sense of interest, I think it forces you to find a solution. Because I do believe the Chinese government will not negotiate under pressure. But at the same time, Chinese government will not negotiate without pressure. Because if there is no pressure, Tibet is a non-issue. So there ought to be a pressure, but at the same time, leave enough space to save, quote-unquote, face, and then hopefully Chinese government will respond positively. In that sense, there's a really big interest among Chinese students and scholars about Tibet. And hopefully through this interest, You are forced to find a solution, one way or the other, hardliner or the moderate, and I hope it will lean more towards moderate line.
I certainly agree that part of the problem has been that the focus has been Dalai Lama-centric, and I hope I haven't contributed to that, because I think the fact is that there is a lot of focus on the Tibetan position being simply what the Dalai Lama says, without regard to the voices. I would say that there are different voices inside Tibet also. We shouldn't assume when we say we need to listen to voices inside Tibet, we should not imagine that we're just going to hear one thing coming from inside Tibet. Although at the same time, you can collate these things and you will get a sense, if we could do this scientifically, a sense of what the general feeling is inside Tibet. I think the Dalai Lama has actually contributed a lot to this, because a lot of Tibetan popular sentiment has not been in accord with what he has been proposing. And yet he and his government around him have basically presented this as the Tibetan position. For the most part. Sometimes they've said, and this is largely strategic or tactically, they've said that, there are some Tibetans who disagree with the Dalai Lama, but then they're usually presented as extremists and perhaps violent, so to create pressure that one should listen to the Dalai Lama's position. As far as, with regard to Mel Goldstein, in Tibet, I find this very interesting because, as some of you may know, Jamyang Norbu has written a two-part critique of Mel Goldstein's book, which is now translated and circulating inside through the internet in China, and I've heard that it's getting a lot of hits. Which brings one final comment, which I really have to establish my Luddite reactionary curmudgeonly credentials. I'm very gratified. I'm always interested in learning of the new and odd and interesting and fascinating ways people are finding to attach the letters PhD to their names. And so I'm quite taken with the idea. I learned from Alan that there is now a field called Internet Studies.
Well, I don't know if it's a degree-granting field.
It will be, I'm sure.
But it's significant in that, and particularly, I think this is a general phenomenon, but think about the way that people write about China and then use resources from the web to validate a particular point without any consideration of methodology. Just both people in the media and scholars as well. So I think Tashi's point is very well made, and I just want to I want to clarify on these grounds that I think that during March there was such an outpouring and different ways to measure, both in terms of volume and as you said, it's kind of hyper-nationalist, that I think had an effect on the way that Beijing then handled the aftermath of the demonstrations, and I think boxed them in. At the same time, without any question, there is a plurality of voices with reference not to actually the formation of political identity in China, I think probably less vis-a-vis Tibet, but more in other areas. And then you look, for example, over the past month at the type of postings that have gone up, that have been viral about the milk scandal, that make direct reference actually to the government's narrative of the rise of China, and have done it in biting and satirical ways. And again, that suggests that when we look at China today, you have to look broadly and deeply if you're going to get any sense of where this country's at and where it's likely to go. I don't know what that means for Tibet policy, and frankly, I think probably it becomes a secondary issue as the state's trying to juggle all the other challenges it has in Beijing. As long as Tibet's relatively quiet, it's not on the top of the list. It's when there's a crisis, and then the reaction is, I think, largely predictable. The rest of it is just back burner, keeping things going. That's my impression as a China specialist, not as someone who's particularly versed in Tibet policy.
Any more questions? Okay. Being the moderator, I have the privilege of asking the final question. So, being of Chinese origin and being superstitious, I always try to avoid to talk about the potential demise of a person. However, I was just wondering if the Dalai Lama were to suddenly die, what are the implications from that politically? Specifically, how would that affect the pro-Tibetan independence movement globally? And in terms of determining his successor, would it mirror what the PRC government did with the selection of the Panchen Lama? If this is just directed at any of the three panelists, if you can offer some thoughts on that.
Okay, I'll start, and then my sense is that this has been actually a pretty big component of Beijing's policy for the past 10 to 15 years. It's a waiting game. And their sense is they'll be in a better negotiating position without the Dalai Lama. They'll be able to either work with different sort of factions within the Tibetan community. And I have no impact on Chinese policy, but the few people I know that do have some influence, I've tried to explain to them that I think this is really misguided, and that they need to be very careful what they wish for. I think a fractured Tibetan community it'll be much harder to reach some sort of resolution. If Hu Jintao if he was smart and had the will to do this, he should cut a deal now. It's the best deal they're going to get, and then solve the Tibet problem. And then China goes on to be a great power. I think they may look back on this just as I think Deng. If you look back at the decisions that Deng made between 79 and 82, not so much as a reference to Tibet, but with Taiwan, think about the deal that China could have had on Taiwan with the KMT in the 80s, and then how much energy and resources Beijing has had to spend on cross-straits relations subsequently. So that if they're smart, I don't know if it's good for Tibet or not, but from Beijing's perspective, this is not a good strategy as far as I'm concerned.
I'll just quickly comment on hyper nationalism, towards Tibetans, because I'm not a China specialist at all, but just taking interest. You see similar nationalism towards Japan, right? Even Taiwan, even Indonesia at one time, even U.S., right? But it seems to swing, now China, Japanese Navy ship is docking in China. And the sense of nationalism or hyper-nationalism towards Japan seems to have kind of really come down a bit. Similar towards China too, right? I think during the spy plane accident, and especially bombing of Chinese embassy in Serbia, many Chinese students went and protested in front of protest through, I was told, through the Chinese embassy, and they were throwing stones and tomatoes and eggs, but the majority of it landed in the visa section. And similarly with Indonesia, I remember some Chinese students, going protesting in front of the Indonesian embassy and consulate in New York, but all seemed to die down after some time. I think this is the same group of people who just ventilate their sense of nationalism when government shows them one direction, they do it, and then it just goes away. When Chinese government again shows them other direction. Now, as for the Dalai Lama and passing away, he himself mentioned it, so it's not inauspicious, I should say. But then, because it's not like the Dalai Lama dies away and then disappears, right? We believe in reincarnation. 15th Dalai Lama will come, I, for one, actually, I propose that Dalai Lama should appoint the 15th Dalai Lama, 15 or 20 years old boy, as the next Dalai Lama for a practical reason. Obviously, Chinese government will make, fuss and criticize the process. So what? They will do it anyways when he dies, when we select the next Dalai Lama. Why the appointment makes sense for Tibetans is, one, we want, everybody acknowledges that this Dalai Lama has been great to Tibetan people and to some extent to the world. Now, who is the best person to educate and train the next Dalai Lama to be like himself, right? So if you appoint a 15 or 20 years old boy as the 15th Dalai Lama, and this Dalai Lama can train him to be like him, maybe Elliot will say minus the middle path policy, but I think he's the best person to do it. And if Dalai Lama goes on to live, maybe even we are lucky 100 years old, by then the 15th Dalai Lama will be 30 plus or 40 years old, right? And we will have a young, dynamic, similar 15th Dalai Lama who will lead the Tibetan movement and continue. I think that's what I find I think in the special meeting, this is what I'm going to raise as well. I think that's logical, and we should. I think it should be done.
Well, I guess I get the privilege of the final answer then, since I sit next to the moderator. This question of the demise of the Dalai Lama, I would agree with Alan that this has been a part of Chinese calculations for quite a long time, 15, 20 years. Of course, you know, the first major incarnation that was chosen under Chinese tutelage was the Karmapa. And this basically at that time seemed like a trial run, whether one could choose a high-ranking incarnation and then train him to be, as the previous Panchen Lama once said many, many years ago when interviewed by Stuart and Roma Gelder, a patriotic socialist Lama. Well, it didn't work with the Karmapa. As everybody knows, the Karmapa fled. And then there was the Panchen Lama. And again, I guess this is something of a trial run too, but one thing the choice of the Panchen Lama showed that it is indeed possible for China to choose a high-ranking incarnation and put him in his position against the wishes of perhaps a majority of the Tibetan population, which doesn't recognize him. I mean, and again, you know, in terms of determining Tibetan attitudes and opinions, it's rather difficult to, you can't really do a scientific survey. And I'll say this about, the times when I've managed to ask people about the Panchen Lama in Tibet, I usually get one of two answers. Is this the real Panchen Lama? I said, no, that's the Chinese Panchen Lama. That's the first answer. Second answer is, I'm not allowed to say. I just haven't gotten anybody saying, yes, that's him. And they're making the same calculations with regard to the Dalai Lama. However, with regard to saying, if China were to come to an agreement with the Dalai Lama that would so far advance things, I would have to say that I think relates to what Tashi said about things being too much Dalai Lama-centric. If the Dalai Lama if China came to some sort of understanding with the present Dalai Lama, and he were to go back to Tibet, make no doubt about it, he would become the focus of Tibetan aspirations, regardless of what he said. Tibetans have an infinite capacity for being able to take those aspirations, and when they hear the Dalai Lama or someone else who's revered say something which is contradictory to that, they say, well, he has to say that. He has to say that. I think China is very much aware that in 1959, when you had this revolt, the Dalai Lama did not support it. The Dalai Lama was not a rebel in 1959. He was swept away by that tidal wave, swept up in it, and then brought to India. And there is this notion that no matter what the Dalai Lama says, he can very much still be seen by Tibetans, become the focus of those aspirations. Now, the interesting thing is Nicholas Kristof had said that also, they should make a deal with the Dalai Lama. And in this well-known column in the New York Times a couple of months ago, in which, drawing upon Mel Goldstein, he said, now the Dalai Lama has to accept, he has to understand he's going to have to accept a Tibet without free elections, without democracy. I mean, the sort of conditions that if they were occurring anywhere else, Nicholas Kristof would be writing a column denouncing. But he's telling the Dalai Lama he has to accept these things. And so the question comes up, well, what then happens under such an arrangement when the Dalai Lama has to preside over the suppression of people's demands for a democratic right to self-determination or something else? It's very, very fraught. Now, having said that, China's policy is to bide its time while until the Dalai Lama passes away, and in the interim, its policy was to get him to denounce ever more loudly the idea of independence for Tibet, which he did. He's saying, no, they don't understand me. While this is going to be a rather dangerous period inside Tibet in terms of leadership, it's also, I think, going to be somewhat problematic outside of Tibet, because there is also the possibility of fragmentation within the Tibetan exile community. I would remind people here, if they know anything about the Karmapa, that the current Karmapa, whom most people recognize as the Karmapa, that recognition is not wholly uncontested. And factionalism and infighting in the Tibetan exile community is also a possibility. This might be one of China's calculations as well. I don't really know. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Please join me in applauding our three panelists. This concludes our session. Thanks.